Hello, I'm Stephen Smith, Chancellor of Henricus College 1619, America's first college, revived. It was set up originally in 1619, which we, of course, have that in our name to make that point, how early this school was. And who set it up is an interesting story, and why they set it up. The first people that came here from England during the first 15, 20 years hardly knew how to live over here in America. And one of the first things they did was set up a college. That's unique all by itself. And when people say that it didn't turn into a modern day college, my answer to that is yes, it did. It took a while to do it, but it became developed into the College of William and Mary. And William and Mary acknowledges that's the roots of their school. And they also, by the way, use that to prove that they're earlier than Harvard. That's a whole separate issue. And I have kind of fun about that, because my college was set up in 1619, Harvard was 1636, and William and Mary was 1693. So when they argue about who's first and who's second, I just stand back and just laugh and say, well, you all are arguing about who's second and third. We're the first. And that irritates both of them. So I have to admit I enjoy that a little bit. But we're making a point about that America was planned before they came here. We didn't start from the time we landed, we, the English people that came over. Most of the historians present it that way in 1607, and then they talk about the three ships that arrive and what they did. No, that's not the beginning. That's step two. The beginning was the plan, and it was organized, written down, argued about in the middle of all sorts of other things happening in England, and with fighting with different countries in Europe, or kingdoms, not really countries. And they came anyway, and they were fighting with King James also. And there was a set of people in England who were, we'd call them Bible fanatics today, but there were so many of them that it didn't seem like Bible fanatics at all, because it was just everywhere. The Protestant part of England was just alive, and they were trying to get good Bibles translated and versions up, and they're competing which were the best versions. And in and around all of that, they were quite aware of King James, who claimed to be an absolute ruler. He owned everything. He was the law. And they were some timidity and some temerity, both saying, no, sir, you're not the law. And you don't set the law. That's God's job. And with all due respect, sire, you're not God. Well, he didn't want to hear that, so he put people in a dungeon, literally. And I said, you can't do that either. So he put them in jail too. And somebody else would protest and put him in another dungeon. And he finally said, well, you better not speak out like that, so you're not going to prove much of anything from down in the third lower dungeon below the ground. So they kind of began to soften that rhetoric and get their stuff together, and came up with the Virginia Company, and they set it up as a corporate structure. And that was a new thing at the time, was how to finance ventures. Because before that, if you financed the ship to go overseas somewhere, and that ship caused a wreck with another country's ship, or your own country and another ship, or did some damage, then you were liable too, because you were the investor, the owner. So if they sued them, they'd sue you too. So they came up with this thing about joint stock capitalism, and that made all the difference in the world, because your liability at that point was limited to how much stock you put in, how much money you put in, and that's registered in the stock. You own so much stock, and it's worth so much at different times. And if they get sued for something, the maximum they can do is take your stock, or the worth of your stock. And all of a sudden, money was available for doing all sorts of things. So they were incorporating things all around. And the Virginia Company was set up under the name of Queen Elizabeth, who's the previous monarch of England, and she was a virgin queen, so they were referring to sorts of things. Virginia was exploring the world, and they were sailing all over the world. All kinds of people were doing that. And so they named this part of North America Virginia in honor of her, because it was first being explored along the coast during her time. And when they actually got over here, they named one of the little islands over here, they named it Jamestown after King James. And Henricus College and the city of Henricus, set up in 1611, and Cape Henry down at the ocean where the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean come in, were named after Henry, King James's eldest son and the heir apparent. He did not become king because he died as a young man, about 18 years old. He got very ill with something and died pretty quickly. But his name lives on in all sorts of ways. And it's Latin version of Henry, or Henry's an anglicized version of Henricus, actually. And the college is referred to, and the city of Henricus are referred to both ways, as Henrico or Henricus. Some people say Henricus, and I believe that probably the way they would have said it would be Henricus. So I've chosen to say it that way. Now, there's a Henrico County around Richmond. Used to be all the way around Richmond, and then they divided it into two separate counties. But it's still there and functioning as part of the greater Richmond community. And we could call it Henrico College, but then that sounds like it's part of Henrico County. And that leads you into a whole nother set of explanations about, no, that they have nothing to do with this today anyway. So we decided to call it Henricus. That's also in the record. So, and that's older sounding, different sounding. That's the Latin version. And the only argument against that is they said that at this time, the English were so mad at the Roman Catholic Church that they wouldn't say anything that even remotely promoted peaceful anything with the Latin stuff. But that wasn't totally the case in England. There were certain people that felt that way, obviously, but others didn't. They wanted to try to repair the breach between England and the Vatican, and others said, no way. But anyways, during in and around all that, the word Henricus has come and survived, and today it just stands out as a distinctive name. So we also spell college with a D. And when you look at that, Colledge, and when I first started this school up and revived it in 1992, I was scared to death to put that D in there. I said, people look at that, oh yeah, some college, you can't even spell the word college. This is, So I did not put it in there that first several months. And then when I'd introduce the topic of the college, people always want to know, where is it? And then I'd have to, and what do you do? And how many majors do you have? And how many students? And it just get into like a typical college. So I'd spend, if I talked to them for 15 minutes, I'd take 13 of it, telling them what we did not do. And then 2 minutes actually finally getting around to what we did. And I said, no, that's backwards. I'm going to take 2 minutes to say what we're not, and then the rest what we actually do. So then I took a really deep breath and stiffened my spine, and I put that D in there and tried it out. And when people heard the word and then saw it spelled, they knew this was not something that they were familiar with, so they didn't, all their presumptions about what college just were in suspense. Well, what is this? I thought, perfect. Now you ask me, what do we do? Who are we and what do we do? So that was one of the best things I ever did. And it's amazing to me now that it took me a step of courage to spell it the historically correct way. But I'm trying to do the college today pretty much model after the way they did college then, too. It's not only spelled the same way knowledge is spelled, by the way. That's College and knowledge are academic kissing cousins, spelled the same way and linked together on purpose. And during the intervening several centuries, about 200 years ago now, we dropped the D out of college in America. So now it looks like it's unusual, but to them, without the D, they couldn't even say that. What is this? This is the oddball, would have been. So anyway, we've kept that in there, and I'm glad we have done so, because that, as I say, talk about what do we do. And then we added the name 1619 to our title officially. And that's on purpose, because that date 1619 is historically significant all by itself for a bunch of other reasons. And that's when the college was first founded. And we said, well, we'll just link right in with that and tell the whole story of 1619. All sorts of things happened. And I've had people say, though, things like, boy, where you get that from? Ain't no such a thing as a college on the James River before the Pilgrims came over here and founded America. And you making that up. Where you getting that from? And it took me a while to figure out how to answer that properly, but I do have an answer for it. And basically, it goes like this. Have you ever heard of the Virginia General Assembly? Well, sure. The first General Assembly met in 1619 in Jamestown Island in the church. Yeah, I remember that. And then that they kept records. We call it minutes today, but they call it basically the records. And so you can look, and that means you probably have not seen the records of the 1619 General Assembly, right? And hardly anybody's seen that unless they're involved in it professionally some way. And most everybody said, well, no, I've never seen that. I said, well, whenever you do, someday you may have a chance to look at them. And the first day they met, they did their credentialing. The people that came to be members of the General Assembly had to present who they were, their identity, and that they had the right to be a voting member. And if you didn't meet those, then of course you wouldn't be allowed to even be present, much less speak or do anything. So they took that was the first big step. That was pretty big too, to presume to represent the people wherever you live. That was a relatively new thing. That's in English. The way they did that was very English. Of course, they were English too, but they were the English that liked the representative government idea, meaning they didn't like the idea of a monarchy. So they weren't interested in changing out King James, putting a different king in. They didn't want a king at all. And he was warned about this too the whole time to that Virginia company. You better watch them. They're going to do away with monarchy. Not only over there in North America, but here too. So you better stop them. And this was a continual conflict. Continual. So the fact that they had a General Assembly and elected their leaders, they were doing that in England too with Parliament, but they also had the king, and the king was over here too. They didn't flee England. They were extending English liberty over here. That's an important point too. Anyway, the second day they met, they came back together. They divided things up. So, okay, you take this topic, and you take this topic, and you take this topic, and come back, and we'll deal with your recommendations, and then bring them to the whole body and vote in favor or against or amendments or whatever. So they came back that second day, the first actual day of actual business, and they founded the college. And there it is, right in the record of the Virginia General Assemblies, their procedures. The record of their proceedings is to found this college. And they called it a work of conversion, and they identified where it would be up the river from Jamestown. And they knew where that was. They knew that there was already a city up there called Henricus, and they wanted it to be adjoining the city, which had an area outside a little bit with the impalement, so they had kind of a fort area. So part of the college was inside the impalement, but most of it was outside, all along the north side of the James River for 12 or 15 miles, depends on which year you're talking about, because the boundaries shifted a little bit, up to the fall line, which is now where Richmond is. And so that was a 10,000 acre campus, huge thing, all along the river. And they had big plans, and they knew they're talking in the field. They didn't have enough students, aged people here to go to college or to a university, but they did have different plantation areas along the river. And a plantation, by the way, to them meant some place where you're doing agricultural stuff, producing more than for your own needs. You're selling, that's a plantation. And you can have a little one, big one, whatever, but we're on this side of the Civil War, so when we say plantation, we think of these gigantic acreages and all that, but this is way before any of that happened. They still call them, and the people that lived there were called planters. And if they were planting, and that's what everybody did, actually, and they also did other things too, but and the planters were at different locations along the river all the way up to the fall line. The bulk of the population was up toward the fall line. It was not around Jamestown. That was hardly anybody that lived down around Jamestown. They all lived up 60, 70, 80 miles up the river. And so they had little clusters of people. One of the criticisms of themselves was you had a little cluster of people here, and then a little cluster of people there, and another little cluster somewhere else. And if you had trouble at any of these little clusters, it was difficult for the other clusters to know about it. And then it took a while to get together to come over to help. And if it was some kind of a fight with some group, you could very easily get there too late. So that was one of the criticisms. But nevertheless, that's how it was spread out like that. So then you would raise your children in that, and there'd be several sets of families. And so they would hire a tutor to come and live there. And they rotated crops, and sometimes they let the field just be fallow that year. And they'd put a little building up, that's the old school building. And then the kids right around that cluster would come and go to classes. We think of that as on a little house on the prairie type schools, but that's the same idea, but that's a couple hundred years later. But they had a series of these little schools all up and down the James River. The graduates of those schools would then go either into the college or to the university, which they planned. But that was going to be another dozen years, because these were just little teeny kids, and there weren't enough of them to just justify it. But they still had the plan there. This is the important thing. They were thinking big time, thinking long term, and some marvelous things happened. And carrying this over from the examples in England and Scotland, I might mention that the plan for even the representative government really is Scottish, and the plan for education, and why they call the board a board of visitors. Let me mention that a minute too, because that's distinctive. You had the central government, and you had these little colleges around, and the central government would go out there, send somebody to visit the campus and see how it's doing. What do you need? How's it going? Where are your people? What do they do when they graduate? And come back and report. So the central government could keep tabs and allocate resources properly. And the most of it didn't fund the schools, but still they were part of the overall plan. So we have a board of visitors, William and Mary, for instance. And Henricus College has a board of visitors also for that same reason. And the earlier the college is in America, the more likely they are to have a board of visitors. Everybody else has a board of directors or just a board. And that's kind of one of those distinctive little features about that shows up there. So we're talking about Henricus College, 1619. And I'll mention a couple other things that happened in 1619 on that date. The General Assembly, that was probably the big thing. And they're the ones that set the college up. So those two go together. And people want to argue about where am I getting this information from? I'm making this up and all that. I just refer them to the records of the Virginia General Assembly. Take it up with them. You want to argue about them with their records? Go ahead. And that usually stops the argument right there. There was a shipload of women that came over that were recruited in England to come over here to be wives. Not call girls and dance hall girls, none of this. They had a very vigorous recruiting process through the churches to vet. They had to come from good families and have good moral character and stuff and come over, and then the church would recommend them to the Virginia Company, and they recruited pretty wildly over there. They said, look, we need women and families over here in Virginia or this isn't going to last. You can't have it based on a bunch of guys. It just won't work. They won't stay here. If they're successful, they make a lot of money and go home and be a big shot back in England. And they said, no, this is permanent. And they called the church, by the way, a church organization, a parish. That's a permanent kind of an arrangement. So you had the parish of Jamestown, the parish of Henricus, the parish of whatever. That's another little indicator that they intended to come here and be permanent. And so the women came with the understanding, being interviewed by the company, that we intend for you to go over there. We will pay your way over there. And you will have, on your part, you will have to make a good faith effort to find one of those guys over there and marry him and settle in with a house somewhere and have children, family. Now, you don't have to guarantee us that you'll marry somebody, but we want you to have a good, that's the intention. So don't even come over if you just want to go over there for an adventure or something. No, you had to plan to be somebody's wife. And by the way, there's a whole lot of men, and there aren't very many of you, so you're going to have your choice. So when the ship lands and the men come to see the women, they say, oh, no, not you, not you. Oh, yeah, you look pretty good. Come over. No, you look better for you. You're going back and find, oh, this is the one I want. And then they would connect up. And within a couple of months, all of them were married. So that was very successful. And they lived up near Henricus. They didn't live at Jamestown. That's another important piece. The college was up there. The city of Henricus, which had been the capital originally, was up there. And it's been rebuilt too today. And the college was scheduled to be up there, and they were working on it. That was where the population was. And why so far away from the coast? They had instructions. When you land over there, you find the river that trends to the northwest and sail up that river about 100 miles and then find a place to set up your principal seat. That's what they call the principal seat, S-E-A-T-E, seat. And it turns out you come up the James River 100 miles and you're right at the fall line, which is Richmond, which is the principal seat of today's Virginia. That's kind of interesting. But they didn't set it up right there at the fall line. They came down river a little bit and they found a better place, much more defended. But why so far away from the coast? Because they'd been at war with Spain for about 20 years. And they were raiding. They'd had official peace with Spain now for not very long, actually. And they didn't trust each other. And Spain was Roman Catholic, and they claimed that the Pope gave Spain half the world, and they gave Portugal the other half. Well, this area was Spanish. And they claimed that it belonged to them. And the English said, we don't recognize the authority of the Pope. We don't recognize there is such a thing as a Pope. And that's what the whole entire Spanish Armada invasion was 20 years before Jamestown was about to settle that issue. Well, Spain lost that one. And the English were convinced then that we were on the side of God in this thing. And he had commissioned us to spread the gospel to the world and not do it through Europe. There's always fighting. This one, Protestant, Catholic. But to go over here to North America, go along this river, which they named the James River after James, in honor of him as the king. They didn't like him personally, but he was the king. And to establish a Judeo-Christian commonwealth. That's what, if you read their stuff, that's what they were intended to do. And once they got that established, then they were going to go from there and evangelize the entire earth. That was the big plan. And that's disappeared out of today's history. We don't, we got a whole different notion of separation of church and state and all that. But these guys were fired up. They were leaving home, which is England, which had just beaten the greatest sea power in the world, which was Spain, and they were on the go. But still, they had to leave and come over here permanently. That was the idea, to come over here permanently and stay over here and settle this thing and create this commonwealth. And so that's an important piece of the story, is why did they come over here? And if you don't have the records of the Virginia Company to look at where they described all this, it's got letters back and forth from Virginia over to England and from England to Virginia. And they're talking about all sorts of, some of them are formal letters, formal meetings, minutes of meetings, economic reports, shipping records, and a lot of it is just people writing to their families back and forth about what they're doing and how they feel and things that scare them and things that worry them and things that had these big hopes. And it's just tremendous amount of information. And I will say probably at this point, aside from bringing the college back into existence and pointing out that there was this effort, the idea was there and they were trying to build it, that's significant in terms of their mindset and their thought style and their worldview. But also that we found the records. They've been gone, not known. And I didn't know about them either. I used to work at Jamestown, and I wasn't satisfied with this little dinky little thing we had for an interpretive outline. It was just nothing really. And I wanted to know more about why they came over here. I said, I know England would not allow people, they just wouldn't allow English people to come sail over here and start World War, whatever it would have been with Spain. No, you're going to tangle us into another dang war. And so they had to have some control over that and tell them where they can go and what they can do and what they can't do and all this. I said, there's got to be some written something. And everybody told me, well, whatever was written down has been destroyed over the centuries. England had the Civil War, and that tore it up, almost everything they got. And we had our own Civil War in the 1800s, and that tore up the rest of whatever. So we have no records. We have copies of correspondence that mention the records and some of the things, but we don't have the records. So we can't present the records. We don't have them. And I was, in particular, I want to know about Jamestown. I was working at Jamestown. So I wanted to know what is a charter, a Jamestown charter. So I got on a quest about that, and I went to every library that's available. I went to every estate sale, every antiquarian bookstore that I ever could find or heard of, looking for the Jamestown Charter, looking. I did that for a whole year. And I got tired of being told, no, there's no such thing. If it ever existed, we don't have it now. And I don't know anybody else that has it. Hope you find it. Good luck. Bye. And I got so tired of being told no. And I went down to Hampton one day for some reason and stopped in the big library down there and went in the reference section. And I was just about to turn around and leave. I just don't want, they're going to tell me the same thing everybody else has told me. And this nice little lady comes over and said, sir, can I help you find something? And I almost told her no. But I found myself saying, yes, I'm looking for the Jamestown Charter. So she did one of these things, cocked her head, and you could see her mentally going through all the files in the whole library. You could almost hear her ticking it off, tick, 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 tick. And then she went outside the library. She went through the whole world of libraries. And she finally stopped and said, well, so we don't have that. And I don't know that anybody that does have it, and I don't know where to suggest that you might look further, because I said, I've looked all over the place. She said, well, and so I almost told her, I told myself, that's what I thought. They were going to tell me no, but at least I tried. And then as I was getting ready to leave, starting to turn, she said, but we do have something that might be of interest to you. And I was, okay, what is that? She said, well, it's the records of the Virginia Company. And I thought, I don't even really know what the Virginia Company is exactly, but I didn't want to hear about the business part of this. I wanted to hear about the whatever. And but then I thought, well, I'm here. I wouldn't come down here to look at that, but I'm already here, and she's offering it. So I said, okay. So went over to the table, and she came out and brought this big 8.5 by 11 book. It's about that thick, and came over and set it down on the table. And then she said, there's more. She came and brought the second one that side, the third one that side, and a fourth one. 4 books like that. Turned out to be about 3,000 pages worth of material. And it's called the Records of the Virginia Company. It's not, and it includes the charter for Virginia, the Virginia Charter of 1606. There is no Jamestown Charter, never has been. And that's why nobody could find it. But we weren't even looking for the Virginia Charter. Nobody even considered that, apparently. And here it's been sitting there in archival obscurity for ever since it was put together, which was the final version of that 4 sets of books was in 1936 or something like that. It wasn't all put together that year, but that's the final year it was in the current form. And I looked at this and I was just stunned. So I said, I wouldn't read through this. It'd take me 2 or 3 lifetimes to read through this whole bunch of stuff, bunch of dry. I figured, oh man. And I still didn't have the idea about Jamestown, which is what I was looking for, I thought. But I looked at it, and it says where Virginia was. It gave the latitudes, 34 to 45 degrees north latitude. Unless you're a navigator, what does that mean? It didn't mean anything to me. I knew Virginia was bigger in the old days than it is now, but I didn't know what that meant. There's a big story about what that meant, which we can get into maybe a little bit later, but and then it went on about the purpose pretty quickly. They were coming over, and here's where they were going to be within this set of dimensions, and that the purpose was a statement. It's a paragraph. There's only one statement of purpose in the whole entire Virginia charters. One statement of purpose, because I've heard a bunch of, well, one of the purpose was religion, one of them, but they really were a company, a corporation, and we know that a corporation is based on the notion of profit, so they were coming over here to make money for the stockholders. I've heard that, but till you read it, and that's not what they said. Now, there's a big disconnect between what modern day historians say about the settlers and what the settlers at the time said about themselves. There's a huge disconnect. And we haven't known what they said about themselves. That's what's been missing in our whole story. Well, what did they say their purpose was? The key phrase in that paragraph is quote, propagating of Christian religion. And a company a corporation whose purpose is propagating the Christian religion. I thought that's what the church did. This is a business that was a Christian business, a Christian corporation. And I finally just said, I got to take today's concepts and just put them on a shelf, not forget them, but just put them temporarily. So if you listen to these words, when I'm talking about it, do the same thing. Don't forget what you know about corporations. Don't forget what you know about anything. But when you do that, then listen to what they said about themselves, what they meant, because they were the ones that did it. They set it up. They came over here to put it into practice. They planted it. They came up with the idea and they planted it, like I said. And they also had a little piece, an addendum right in that same paragraph that talked about rule of law. And to bring people to a civility, a Christian civility. And now that stopped me short. I said, maybe I need to read these records. This may not be as dull as I think, because at Jamestown, we didn't talk about the Christian purpose at all. I never saw any reference. That was the Pilgrims. They came over here fleeing religious persecution, supposedly. I found out that's not exactly accurate either. There's a whole lot of stuff. When you get in those actual records, and the Pilgrims, by the way, are in the Virginia Company records. That was a stopper to me also. The Virginia Company lasted from 1606, Jamestown is 1607, city of Henricus upriver is 1611, and the Plymouth is 1620, and the Virginia Company goes to 1624. So it's the first 18 years of America were the Virginia Company years. So whatever they did to set it up, they planned it, they planted it, put it into practice, revived it, redid it, came out with a second charter in 1609, expanded and clarified a bunch of things, and made sure that everybody understood that went all the way to the other coast, from the East Coast to the West Coast. West Coast? That's 3,000 miles away. How did they even know there was a West Coast? That's another story too. The English had been around South America and come up and landed almost straight west of where Richmond is, and the city of Henricus and the college would be San Francisco Bay, just barely below that. Well, they landed just above San Francisco Bay, Admiral Drake, and there's a little place called Drake's Bay, and it's a national park, and that's where he landed, and he claimed everything from there back to the East Coast for England and for Protestant Christianity. And then he sailed on around the world. He was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. The Spanish had already done that, but he was the first Englishman. And so when they landed here, that was in 1579. And when the English came over here in 1607, they came with this plan. They knew about Drake's venture. They knew about his claim. They knew where the latitudes were. Let me say this about the latitude. 34 to 45 degrees north latitude. 34 degrees on the east coast of America is a distinctive place. There's a reason why they chose 34. And that's how far, from, if you're on the equator and you're looking straight up, that's 0. And you crank it up 30, 40, 50, 90 degrees, you're looking at the North Pole. Okay, so it's that kind of on the surface of the globe. So 34 degrees north and south is a particular place on the East Coast. And today it's best known for Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. That's the bottom of Virginia, the original Virginia. It's actually be more like North Myrtle Beach. It's about basically the state line between South Carolina and North Carolina, and the coast is a big curved thing that comes over and then it goes sharply back to the north. And that point out there is called Cape Fear, and that's actually the 34 degrees. Okay, but nobody lives out there. That's not very habitable, but they live around here where all kinds of people are. Well, where's 45 degrees? That's halfway to the North Pole. From the equator to the North Pole, halfway, 45 degrees. Well, where does that come in on the East Coast? Well, it's the border between Maine and Canada. That's 45 degrees. So you put everything together from 34 to 45 degrees, and that's basically the United States we're talking about. And it goes straight to the West Coast. Across the bottom of that is, at the bottom, 34 degrees on the Pacific coast, is Los Angeles. That's the southwest corner of Virginia. Los Angeles, Virginia. How you like that? And there's a big metal sign out there, historical marker, 34 degrees. And here's why. And there used to be an upscale clothing store there, the name of which was 34. And I think they're out of business or they've moved or something. But now there's a cookie company out there that's making 34 cookies. So they still keeping that 30. They may not know why 34, what that has to do with Virginia and all that. But And then you come on up the west coast from Maine and Canada, and you go across and you come out about the middle of Oregon. Later on, we fought the war with England and claimed up to where the coast of Washington and Canada come together, but that wasn't included originally, so they just brought that up and then brought it down to San Diego too. And then there's a whole story about how we purchased La Florida, and we had the little dust up down in Texas called the Alamo, and then we had to fight with Mexico and Spain about the southwest corner of the United States, and they've claimed that still belongs to them, by the way. That's in modern day history. The Secretary of State of Mexico about 10 years ago made a public statement that corner of Southern California belongs to them, always had. The United States stole it from them, and they were going to take it back, and the way they were going to do it was flood that with Mexicans. Just flood it until they got enough people to be the majority. Then they were going to, the signal would go out, and they would vote to secede from California, United States, and rejoin Mexico. Now that's something I never heard on any news station anywhere, except that I saw this thing. It's on YouTube or something. This guy from Mexico claiming that's the state policy of Mexico. That's one reason they're sending these people up here. They're encouraging that for that reason. And it's not poverty. They got all these people trying to do a better life and all this. Well, those stories are true too, but you miss that. Anyway, that's a whole nother story to get into. So anyway, that was what they're talking about. Virginia was from one coast to the other coast, and it was so big and so vast and so far, nobody knows in those days what's between here and the west coast. They didn't really know how far that was either. East and west is hard on the ocean, almost impossible to tell how far, you said, because the current's pushing you this way and the wind's pushing you that way, and you've been sailing all day and you can see the wake of the boat, and you end up not moving an inch or going backwards, and you don't know how far. But north and south is easy. You can tell where the sun is, when you're looking at the horizon and how far the sun is. The higher up it is, the closer you are to the equator, and the farther you go north, the more the sun gets down. Pretty soon, part of the year, you can't even see the sun. Anyway, that's easy, relatively. So, but on land, you can tell how far you go because you measure it, except you got to actually do that, and they didn't know how far. They thought maybe from talking with the people that they call the Indians today, some of them accept Indians as a description of them. Some of them say don't like that, the indigenous people, or they just use their tribal names and so on. Anyway, the English were talking with these folks and said they were looking for the big water. Sign language and stuff, big water. We try to get to the big water. Yes, big water. It's about 3 weeks walk. Every day, walk. Steady march. You can get to the big water. And the English thought that's what they thought. They had gone up to the Blue Ridge, and about 3 weeks after that, they could get to the Pacific coast. Well, what it turns out, they were talking about Lake Michigan. Okay, that's the big water. You can't see from across it. It's so big you can't see across it. Well, you can see across it, but you can't see lengthwise. And that's what the Indians were talking about in Lake Superior and Lake Huron, all those the Great Lakes. Well, that was very encouraging, but very disappointing when they found out they're not talking about the west coast of America at all. And so it took us another couple hundred years to finally, with the Lewis and Clark expedition and all that stuff, under Jefferson as president, to get out there and verify the distance and the routes and all that kind of stuff. But that was the original claim. They were going to make the continent of Virginia was going to be the home of this great Christian commonwealth from which they were to evangelize the rest of the world. And that means America is probably the most successful missionary venture in the history of mankind. It's so big and so successful that we've forgotten it ever was, much less still is, a big missionary venture. That's a whole nother reason why we brought Henricus College together to talk about. That's the original plan. And so anyway, we found those Virginia Company records, and we got them out, and we started getting them reprinted. And I met another guy who was doing stuff with records, and he jumped on that or was already into it. And he was putting it in modern day English, because they're written in kind of Shakespearean English, which is almost like another language. They got those big things below oh man, it's hard to read that stuff. So he was putting it in the regular English. And we now have a summary of the Virginia Company records in 400 pages. And we have that. It's called Tobacco, Corn, and Caviar, and that's based on the three big issues that were coming up in the Virginia Company. You go through their records, these three issues came up all the time. Grow more corn. You need food. That's the basic source of food. Grow corn. And corn was kind of a larger phrase for vegetables and plants and all that kind of just grow more corn. Grow less tobacco. They were doing too much tobacco. There's a big market for that at the time. And the Atlantic sturgeon would come up the James River to about where today's Hopewell is, between Richmond and Jamestown, where the Appomattox River comes into the James River. It's kind of not a bay exactly, but a big expanse of water. The channel is on one side, but it's kind of flat, but it's still a bunch of water there. And the Atlantic sturgeon come up there, and feeding frenzies and mating frenzies and fish eggs every year. And they said it was so thick that you could walk on the sturgeon. Now that's got to be a little bit of an exaggeration, because they're slippery and wet. I don't think you'd want to really try to walk out there. Even if they were really that thick, it would look like you could walk on it. And they produce caviar. Now today, when we get caviar, you get it from the Baltic, Finland, and stuff like that. And that was true in those days too. But then they found the Atlantic sturgeon coming up in the James River producing this caviar, and they checked it out, and the quality was so good. They said, this is better quality than that stuff in the Baltic. It's at least as good, if not better. So cultivate that. So more corn, less tobacco, cultivate the caviar. Those were the three issues that came up over and over and over and over in the daily lives of the people and planning, and where you're going to live and what kind of work you're going to do. You're going to farm, you're going to fish, you're going to what, And so he named the whole book Tobacco, Corn, and Caviar. And he finished his massive publication of this thing, and there are libraries all over the world, in England too, around 1607, 400th anniversary, which was 2007. And then his circumstances changed, and he kind of shut down the publication business and downsized and retired and this sort of thing. And he had some of these books left over, so he offered them to Henricus College. So he gave them to us to use to fundraise. So we have those for sale. We're not a book sales company, but we do have these available. And it's a marvelous, you don't have to buy 3,000 pages worth. You can buy 400 pages worth. Because, you got like 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 documents all dealing with the same topic. Different points of view. You don't need to read all of that unless you're a professional in that. But you do need to read something. So he went, selected out different parts and put them and just condensed it down. And it makes really interesting reading. And you don't have to be a scholar to read it. Like I say, it's in modern day English. And it's real stuff. It's real people talking about real things in a real place, in a real time, and real issues. And they're our forebears. They're the people that created America. In that first 18 years, about everything that we have that's distinctive in America was put in place, planted, and partially developed at least during those first 18 years. Now, most of the Christian historians start in 1620 with the Pilgrims. And I've told them that when the Pilgrims left England to go to Holland, today's Christian historians' brains went with them. And they never even gave a sideways glance, much less a backwards glance at England, what was going on in England, about the whole issue about church and state and the monarchy existence and not, and all that, and capitalism, all this kind of stuff. Rule of law was being hammered out in England, and the Pilgrims went over to Holland, and the historians went with them. And then when they came over to America, the historians stayed with them on the Mayflower and over here to New England, and they say what they planted in New England in 1620 is what created the United States Constitution. They don't show how that really links. So they say must have because they started it, and here it is. So, but how? My challenge to them is show me anything in the Pilgrim worldview that led to a representative system, I call it a limited constitutional republic. It isn't there. I'm sorry, it is not there. Where is it? It's in London, where they're arguing these exact same points, and they brought them on the James River already before the Pilgrims came over. There's the General Assembly, the college, and it goes on and on and on. So we just brought this college back as a platform, the teaching platform, to talk about all this stuff. That's the reason we brought it back into existence. It did exist, and you can't just knock that out and say, well, you know, it didn't have a football team and all that. Well, none of those schools in those days had football teams. That's a modern day, that's got nothing to do with college anyway, especially spelled with the D. But, so that's one of the main features that we do with that. Is to focus on the lineage of that. And we go back to the Magna Carta, which was 400 years before the James River settlements. And they came over here to settle along the river and to settle 100 miles upriver and set their principal seat. They did not come over here to Jamestown. The leader of this, I gotta say this, the leader of the venture, according to the story you hear at Jamestown, was John Smith and his sweetheart Pocahontas. Well, you get back in the record, and they had planned this venture over here for several years. They recruited the people that were going to be on the crew and the passengers. They recruited the ships necessary. They've arranged for the supply of food, how much food they were going to have with them while they planted and figured out how to support themselves once they got here. So they didn't know for sure, so they had to have enough food. And that took years, several years to do that. And just a couple of months before they were to sail, here comes John Smith over with a letter from the king saying, add this man to your crew. So, who is this guy? Put him in the crew. The king says so. So they put him in the crew. And on the way over, they came the southern route, down from England, down to the, and you come straight across into the Caribbean. That's where the currents and the wind and everything, that's the best way to go, fastest. Somewhere in that trip, there was a mutiny broke out, or almost a mutiny, and John Smith knew about it. He either let it, caused it, or at the very least had information about it and did not report that to the actual captain of the voyage, Christopher Newport. And so they put him under arrest. Now that's a capital offense. If he hadn't had that letter from King James, they probably would have executed him. But he did have. That was a little, they don't know if you execute him, you got the whole entire. So they just put him in the brig and sailed on over here, and then sailed up Florida and turned into the Chesapeake Bay. And he was still in the brig during all this time when they landed at Cape Henry. And when they came by Jamestown, came all the way up to the fall line, he was still in the brig all this time. He did not lead these people over here. That's just not true. And I've had people get really mad who have said it is true, it is too true, and they just know it because they've heard it their whole lives. I said, well, what is it based on? They don't know, but they know it's true. So I said, well, let's you and me look at the record. Show me where John Smith is in the record. Well, he's in the brig. And they finally let him out, and they had some turmoil there. A lot of people died and stuff. This was a risky venture to come over here. And he ended up being on the board. One one of the leaders, the governmental board, and enough people that he was elected to be the president of the council. He was not the governor. We've got a big statue down at Jamestown of him, governor of Virginia, and they put the dates on it. Well, I used to threaten that I was going to slip out there at night sometime with a chisel and just dink, dink, dink off the word governor. He was president of the council. He was not governor. They didn't use the title governor. There weren't any governors. There was no governor until later. Then there was a governor. They replaced the system and had a governor. But at the beginning, they were so concerned about this deal of having a monarchy and a one-man rule thing that they made it so you couldn't have such a thing as that. So a president presides over a committee, basically. That's what the government was, a big committee. And the president presides over that, but he doesn't run it. He doesn't tell them what to do. He doesn't give them orders. He calls for votes and keeps the thing together. And that's how they set it up. So when he was the third president of the council, some people say for Jamestown, and I'm saying no, he was the council for the first colony of Virginia, which was the bottom half of this big Virginia thing. The bottom half was called the first colony, clear to the Pacific Ocean. And the second colony was the top part of it, by name, Segunda Colony, same thing, to the Pacific Ocean. And Jamestown is not a colony. It's a settlement within the colony. Henricus is not a colony. It's a settlement within the colony. Plymouth is not a colony. It's a settlement within the second colony. Those are terms that meant specific things to them that we just say, oh, well, the colony was set up here, the lost colony, we slop around on this because we have not had these official records. Well, we, Henricus College, this has been our thing. This is distinctive for us to promote this, and we've had fight after fight after fight after fight, but when we just challenge and say, well, let's go look at the record. Here's go look at somebody else's version of the record, so it's not just me making up stuff. And we've won every one of those arguments, every single one of them, because we've at least had enough sense to look at the record. And what they meant by that, maybe you could argue about, but what they said is, there it is, there it is. And so we are distinctive there, and I needed a platform that I could stand on and challenge these notions about John Smith being the leader of the people that came over here and all that. And so the college was perfect. Took me a while to finally, I tried two other organizations and they both flopped badly. And over here on the side was this college thing. So I said, well, I'm not doing anything else. Let me look at that. So I just pulled the college information around from, whoa, there it is. There's the basis. There's the platform. Let's do that. And let's talk about it. It links up with William and Mary, and it links up with Harvard too. By the way, let me mention that the first guy who came over to be the rector of the college never made it here all the way. He made it to Bermuda. Patrick Copeland, Scottish guy. And his model was Marshall College in Scotland. A very vigorous John Knox type Protestant school. And like I said, board of visitors and that sort of thing. So he came over and started the school there. So we, that's a little bit of an opening about who we are as a school, and we'll talk to you some other time about what we actually do today.